In this lesson, we're going to talk about clauses. So what's a clause? Santa Claus? No, not exactly. No, we're talking about a clause, 从句. A clause is a group of words in English that have a subject and a verb. A subject and a verb. Oh, so a clause is a sentence? No, not so fast. There are two kinds of clauses. There are two kinds of clauses, an independent clause, and let's talk about an independent clause. An independent clause is a sentence, a 句子. Independent, 自理, meaning that it can stand all by itself. An independent clause, 自理从句. It must have a subject and a verb. Okay, it must have a subject and a verb and a complete thought. That makes it a sentence. Another way to call it is an independent clause. It doesn't need anything else to make it complete. Here's an example of an independent clause. The students ran to class. Notice the students, underline, that's the subject, and ran is the verb, to class. This is an independent clause. It is a complete sentence. It doesn't depend on anything else to make a complete thought. The second kind of clause is a dependent clause. Dependent, meaning it depends on something else to make it complete. 依赖从句. It depends on something to make it complete. A dependent clause is not a sentence. It's a group of words that do not have a complete thought. It's also called a sentence fragment. This is a troubled area for ESL students, so pay close attention here. A dependent clause begins with a subordinate conjunction. Subordinate means something that depends on something else for its existence. And a dependent clause depends on the independent sentence that it is attached to. It cannot go by itself. The subordinate conjunction, 从许来此, is the word in particular that makes it dependent. Here's a few examples, as you can see, of some subordinate conjunctions. If, because, although, since, which, while. This is only a partial list. There's a complete list in the Writing Academic English book on page 163, partial list, and 292 to 295 is the complete list. So here's an example of the dependent clause. Because Mrs. Austin cooked dinner. This is not a complete thought. Often you'll see this with students putting a capital B on because and a period and calling it a sentence. It is not. The reason it's not is because of the use of the word because. Although this looks like a sentence, it has a subject, it has a verb, it's not a complete thought. It's a dependent clause because it starts with the subordinate conjunction. Okay, we've got the clauses. There's two kinds of clauses, an independent clause and a dependent clause. With these two kinds of clauses, we can create four basic types of sentences. Let's take a look at the first type of sentence. The first type of sentence I want to talk about is the simple sentence. A simple sentence has one independent clause. Only one. Oops, sorry about that. That's not what I wanted. It has one independent clause. Throughout this, you're going to see I'm going to be using IC for independent, for an independent clause. The independent clause can have more than one subject. It can have more than one verb. Some examples. Mrs. Austin cooked dinner. We have one subject. We have one verb. One subject, one verb. Mrs. Austin cooked dinner and washed the dishes. There's only one subject, Mrs. Austin, but there's two verbs. She cooked and she washed. You can have two subjects, Mr. Austin and Mrs. Austin, two subjects, and one verb. You could have two subjects and two verbs as well. It still makes it a simple sentence. Okay, a simple sentence, and it's made up of one independent clause. Okay, let's check your understanding. Write your answers down, and then you can go on to the next slides to see the answers written down for you. But check your answers first. Write your answers down. Is a clause a sentence? What's the difference between an independent clause and a dependent clause? Write a few examples of a subordinate conjunction. How many kinds of sentence patterns are there in English? Name the first type of sentence and write an example and label the parts in your sentence. After you've finished writing, go on to the next two slides and check your answers. Here are the answers for the questions. Hopefully you have written yours down and you're just checking them. Is a clause a sentence? It depends on what kind of clause you're talking about. An independent clause, IC, is a complete sentence. A dependent clause is not a sentence. Remember, this is the real problem area. You really want to nail what is an independent clause and what's a dependent clause. Okay? What's the difference between an independent clause and a dependent clause? Both kinds of clauses have a subject and a verb, so what makes a difference? A dependent clause has a subordinate conjunction. If that's true, we really want to know what is a subordinate conjunction. So write a few examples of a subordinate conjunction. Here were some examples, and remember that there was a complete list in the Writing Academic English book on page 292 to 295. The next questions. How many kinds of sentence patterns are there in English? There are 4 kinds. We have only looked at the first kind. So the next question is, what's the name of the first kind? It is a simple sentence. A simple sentence has one independent clause. What makes up an independent clause? A subject and a verb. Okay? You've got a subject and a verb, a subject with 2 verbs, or 2 subjects and a verb. An independent clause. One independent clause makes a simple sentence. In the next lesson, we'll go on to look at the other kinds of sentence types. If you had trouble with this, go back and review it again. Make sure you understand.